Welcome, everyone. In our seminar series, we're reaching out across the UK and Europe to look at different things that are happening in the land use sector. So we had a great session a couple of months ago looking at the different land use strategies across the UK. And today we're heading into Europe. We are looking at what's happening in the UK, but in Europe as well, in terms of farmer clusters. And so that's about farmers coming together to produce landscape level biodiversity and other outcomes. So we have representatives here from the Framework Project. So this is a Horizon Europe project. It's great to see that team back together again to talk to us about what they learned in their long-term project. So we're going to have Graham Begg off the start telling us about the project generally. Then we'll have Iris Bohnet talking with Claudio Petucco, and they are going to talk about their experiences in the project. Sorry, in the middle, we're having Rachel Nichols from the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust. So a variety of perspectives there from across Europe, but I will pass to Graham first to give us some background to the project. Now, Graham is a senior research leader and head of the agroecology group in the ecological sciences department at the James Hutton Institute. His specialty is ecosystems, farming, and food systems. His work advances understanding of biodiversity, ecosystem services, and the multifunctional performance of agroecosystems. He leads cross-disciplinary socio-ecological research that partners with farmers and stakeholders to drive real-world transitions towards healthier, more sustainable agri-food systems. So take it away, Graham.
Okay, thank you very much, Leanne. Thanks for the introduction. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us here today. As Leanne mentioned there, I coordinated the Horizon 2020 project framework, and that explored the potential of landscape-scale collective action to support biodiversity in agriculture. That's what it was all about, and it's that project that this webinar is going to be based around. Okay, so let me just set out how we decided to put forward the presentations for this webinar. It's going to be organised into 3 parts, and this really just covers what Leanne briefly told us. I'm going to deal by outlining the problem. So why individual actions, even when they're done well, have struggled to add up to meaningful biodiversity recovery in agricultural ecosystems. So that will set the context. Next, we'll be moving on to look at the approach that Framework set out, and that was focusing on how farmer-led clusters work in practice. And then I'm going to hand over to Iris and Claudio, and they're going to look at the evidence that was generated from the Framework project, what we've learned about outcomes and the enabling conditions. Next slide, please, Kerry. Okay, so let's get to the problem. So I think we can probably largely agree that it's now accepted that agriculture is a major driver of global biodiversity loss. In my mind, there are 2 key processes that underpin much of this decline. So the first is simplification. So as diverse habitats have given way to more uniform cropping systems, the landscape has lost ecological niches, and as a consequence, the species that depend on those. And the second thing that's happened is that we've had intensification. So we've got rising inputs, mechanization, homogenation of crops, and all of this has disturbed ecosystems and reduced in-field resources, so that over time we've got increasing pressure on natural populations and their ability to survive in those agroecosystems. Together, these processes have shaped the agricultural landscapes in a way that really is less capable of supporting biodiversity. Next slide, please, Kerry. Okay, so with that in mind, what does ecological restoration require? Well, it essentially means reversing the trends that I've just described. So we need to boost resource availability, reduce disturbance, bring back habitat complexity, and then create more niches. And really that brings us to the key point of what we've been doing, which is to note that recovery depends not only on what happens within fields, but on the ecological character of the landscape as a whole. Next slide, please, Kerry. Okay, so that's not to say that things haven't been happening already anyway. So farmers already take a wide range of actions to support biodiversity. We know about the introduction of hedgerows, beetle banks, wildflower strips, cover cropping, crop diversification in general, and a reduction in inputs and reduction in tillage and so on. So these measures have reduced disturbance, they've added habitats and complexity, and they do make a difference locally. That is known. The challenge, though, is that they remain localized. So these actions tend to sit within individual farms, and that's limited how much they've been able to contribute to wider ecological recovery. Next slide, please. Okay, so why is that? I mean, why don't these good practices as they are add up to something substantial? So the fundamental problem is that there's a scale mismatch. Okay? Plants and animals typically rely on processes such as movement and dispersal to provide them with access to a full complement of resources that they need at any one point in time, or perhaps to complete their life cycles, or for the populations to flourish as a whole. So species need networks of connected habitats across multiple farms, and so as a consequence, they're dependent on the configuration of the landscape as a whole, not just what's going on in an individual field. So consequently, when interventions are dispersed and uncoordinated as they have been, they rarely accumulate into meaningful landscape level change. And this is one of the key reasons why biodiversity recovery in agroecosystems has remained so difficult. Next slide, please. So, I mean, we have agri-environment schemes. I'm sure most of you will have heard of agri-environment schemes that have helped shift farming towards more sustainable practices by supporting the sorts of actions that I've already described. But they have clear limitations. Their impacts have been modest and inconsistent across landscapes, the point I've already made. And as I've also said, most actions remain farm by farm with limited combined ecological effect. But more than this, the schemes themselves typically don't match other ecological and social realities. They can be short-term, administratively demanding, and insufficiently targeted, among other things. So while these tools are important, they've never been designed to deliver the coordinated landscape scale action that ecological recovery really needs. Next slide, please. So if we step back, the picture becomes clear. We've got biodiversity decline that persists because ecological needs extend beyond individual farms. But in contrast to that, or at least out of sync with that, with measures that the measures that we rely on are too scattered to drive recovery at the scale. Furthermore, the policy tools generally don't support collective planning, and incentives remain individual and short term. So the key message is quite simple. No single farm practice or policy instrument can solve a problem that is fundamentally collective. Okay, next slide, please. So to support this contention, there are examples that have shown coordinated landscape scale approaches can work. So in the UK, farmer clusters, which was the inspiration for the framework project, have brought together farmers around shared priorities and have shown to be successful. In the Netherlands, farmers can only apply for agroecology schemes, agro-environmental schemes as groups. So it can only be done collectively. And these have been successful in improving both targeting and coordination. And then in the past, or at least ongoing, but some in the past, there have been initiatives such as Landcare in Australia and the Green Waipera initiative in New Zealand that have shown that community-based collaboration has been successful at restoring habitats across landscapes as a whole. So from these examples, the pattern can be quite clear that when farmers coordinate across landscapes, biodiversity outcomes improve. Okay, Kerry, next slide, please. Okay, so now we get on to the framework project. So framework was set out to develop and test a model to help farmers manage biodiversity collectively. Okay, that was the core of what we were about. The project examined whether coordinated landscape scale action can achieve more than isolated measures by themselves, and we studied what enabled this kind of collaboration to grow and to thrive. So the approach brings together farmers around shared priorities. It provides practical support in terms of facilitation, tools, monitoring, guidance, and so on, and also attempts to link local action at the cluster to scientific and policy insights. So in short, the whole point of framework was to provide a practical way to make collaborative biodiversity actions possible for farmers. Okay, so my last slide, please, Kerry. Okay, so we just stopped there more or less. Now that's the background. I set out what the drivers of biodiversity decline are, the limits of isolated farm level actions and policy tools, and then also set out the need to coordinate collective action. If we move now on to the next presentation, that's going to look at how clusters work in practice, covering issues of their structure, facilitation, how they support farm leaderships. And then we're going to move on to the final presentation, where we'll be looking at the evidence that's been derived from the framework project, looking at the outcomes, farmer experiences, enabling conditions, and so on. Okay, so I'd like to thank you for listening to that introduction. As we've explained, questions can come later in the discussion. So now I'm happy to hand back to Leanne, who will then introduce Rachel. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Graham. I've not seen any questions of clarification come up. I just want to say that it's a fantastic project and a really important thing to look at. So we're handing over now to Rachel Nichols from the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust. So this is the organization that set up farming clusters to start with in the UK and had the network that was built on for the framework project. Rachel has a background in improving agri-environmental scheme options for wild bees and other insect pollinators here in the UK, and has spent the last 3 years working on the framework project with a focus on assessing the sustainability of farm clusters. So, Rachel, over to you.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
We can indeed.
Okay, great. Yep, so I'm just going to talk you through the farm cluster approach. So if you can just go straight to the next slide. Okay, so farm clusters are groups of local, often neighbouring farmers that agree to work collaboratively to improve biodiversity across their landscape. They'll do this by sharing knowledge, supporting one another, and working collectively in their activities. Next slide, please. So farm clusters, as was previously said, are a UK initiative stemming from back in 2010, when nature improvement areas were established in England, and a highly successful one happened to be farmer-led. So now farmer clusters cover over 450,000 hectares of farmland in the UK. And although collaborative and community farming can be found across Europe, the specific farmer cluster model was relatively new. Next slide, please. So to look specifically at the impact farmer clusters had on overall biodiversity, 11 farmer clusters were established across 9 countries as part of the framework project. These covered a range of landscapes and farming systems, such as arable and mixed farms. We also had some organic farms, vineyards and orchards and grasslands. They ranged from small clusters of just 3 to 8 farms right up to large clusters of just over 20 farms. And they covered a range of sizes too. So with some clusters, I think, were just a few acres in size, and the largest was around 10,000 hectares. You can actually find more details on the formation and management of the framework farmer clusters following the QR code there. Next slide. So each farmer clusters identified their own conservation goals as a collective. So for some clusters, that might have been bringing a locally extinct or declining species back to the area, protecting their waterways, from runoff, introducing integrated pest management. They might have wanted to create more areas of habitat on their land, such as wildlife hedgerows, or adjusting their farming practices to improve soil quality or reduce their carbon footprint. What was important was that these are all goals that were identified by and selected by the farmers and agreed upon as a whole cluster in a bottom-up process, and not determined through any government top-down initiatives. And they try to coordinate their biodiversity goals and their actions across the whole cluster. Next slide, please. So facilitators are an integral component to the farmer cluster model. So each farmer cluster has a facilitator, and typically that is someone with expertise in either farmland conservation or agricultural biodiversity monitoring or agri-environment schemes. This is a photograph of the first in-person meeting of one of the Austrian farmer clusters that was in the framework project. The first in-person meetings had to be delayed due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So that was just bad timing, really. Next slide, please. This is also of the Austrian farmer cluster. This was a nest box making workshop that was organised by the facilitator. So facilitators are key to the whole process. Without that advisor organising events and bringing the farmers together, combined with their expertise in habitat management for farmland biodiversity, farmer clusters can struggle to gain momentum or know how to put their goals into action. and the facilitators were able to tailor their advice to each farm depending on what the overall cluster goals were. So it wasn't following a specific agri-environment scheme ever. It was asking the farmers what they wanted to do and making sure that they were able to input that. So the facilitators support coordination between the farmers. They support learning through workshops and events, and they initiate stakeholder engagement where possible and look for funding opportunities. They basically handle a lot of the admin and the farmer-to-farmer communication and the cluster-to-community engagement. This is a photo of the orchards in the Luxembourg farmer cluster, which we'll look at more in a bit. Next slide. So farmer clusters really benefit from additional resources beyond their facilitator, such as software tools, guidelines, protocols, training for both the farmers to use and the facilitator to help guide. Many of these resources were created throughout the framework project for our farmer clusters, but also any external or future clusters to use. Next slide. So one highly useful tool is FEAST, a decision support tool for habitat, species and ecosystem service assessment created by a team at the University of Hertfordshire. The QR code takes you directly to the FEAST website. It has a very user-friendly interface that allows farmers or facilitators to easily see how they could create or move specific semi-natural habitats around on their land to optimize it for a specific species or species group. Next slide, please. During the framework project, multiple guideline documents were produced for the different aspects of setting up and managing a farmer cluster, as well as for how to monitor biodiversity on the farmer cluster to track its progress. It's really important that biodiversity is regularly monitored in the cluster, as it not only helps to understand what actions the farmers are implementing is actually helping biodiversity, but it really encourages the farmers with regular evidence of their hard work. Again, if you follow the QR code, you'll be able to find these guidelines as well as the others produced during the project. Next slide, please. Additionally, a training course for facilitators was also created called Landscape Leaders. This course was designed to help facilitators build skills around farmer engagement, biodiversity monitoring, and project planning. This is freely available for anyone to sign up to learn from. Again, just follow the QR code if you want to have a look. And we also developed tools. So this was a practitioner sustainability assessment tool to help the farmers in the cluster track their sustainability easily, but also give them clear steps on what they could do should they want to improve their sustainability. Claudio will go through some of these results in a bit, I think, and also you can download it by following the QR code. So we've talked about the farmer cluster and the facilitator and their immediate resources. However, farmer clusters are much more than just their central unit. They are part of a much wider network of actors and processes, as represented by this social ecological network map of the Luxembourg cluster. This cluster really benefited through its relationship with a local stakeholder, a cider company, as you can see through the significant area of purple circles here, which relate to the stakeholders. This stakeholder used the cluster's apples to sell their product at a premium, and the cluster was basically financially viable through this connection. So engaging with the wider network can mean connecting clusters with policymakers or markets and stakeholders, or utilising scientists and social science experiments. It allows us to collect evidence from clusters and feed it back into national or EU discussions. And this means that the farmer clusters can not only utilise the wider network, but can also influence it. Next slide, please. One vital part of the wider network is the immediate local community. So when farmer clusters can engage with the local community, it helps to create momentum and ensure longevity of the cluster. So farms held BioBlitz events, citizen science biodiversity monitoring days, workshops such as wildlife photography, farm visits to schools, as well as an array of other activities over the course of the project, some of which are shown in the photos here. So this wasn't just a bunch of farms in the same area initiating a handful of uncoordinated agri-environment schemes on their land. This was a whole community working towards a goal collaboratively, trying to integrate farmers and members of the public, all with the goal of improving aspects of biodiversity across the landscape. Next slide, please. Finally, Recodo is a real hub of the whole farmer cluster experience. It's a website supporting the flow of information across the varying levels of the farmer cluster. So on the website, farmers can find resources, connect with other farmers, and share their experiences. And again, if you follow the QR code, it will take you to the website. Last slide. So in summary, we believe that when farmers are properly supported, they can lead the biodiversity initiatives on their land, self-selecting and collaborating in a bottom-up approach. A farmer cluster with its facilitator, external resources, and then wider network structure allows farmers to do this and not just utilise the wider network, but influence it. And this is how farmer clusters enable real landscape scale change. However, these weren't just different clusters and farming systems in different countries. They were different historical and cultural backgrounds. They were different ways of thinking, different experiences, and these came with an array of challenges, resulting in different outcomes, which Iris and Claudio will talk about next. Thank you.
That's terrific. Thanks, Rachel. Fantastic set of resources coming out of the project there. So please do put your questions in the chat if you have things that are cropping up in your head and thinking, you know what, I really would like to know more about this, and we'll come to them at the end. But we do have one more presentation. This is from Iris Bohnet and Claudio Petucco. They are respectively a social ecologist with a background in landscape planning and a PhD in landscape ecology from Imperial College London. I think that's Iris Bohnet. She has over 20 years of international research experience, primarily in transdisciplinary projects to address sustainability challenges in Australia and Europe. I know her from being based in the Czech Republic, so she's moved around. In Australia, she worked for over a decade at the CSIRO, and the past 7 years she worked at the Czech University of Life Sciences, Prague, where she was responsible for research internationalization, including leading the Czech team on framework. Claudio Petucco is a lead R&T scientist at the Luxembourg Institute of Science and Technology, where he specializes in ecosystem services assessment, biodiversity, and sustainability modeling. He has been involved in several European projects as well as framework with a focus on sustainability assessment and decision support tool development in both rural and urban contexts. His work bridges environmental science and practice by integrating ecosystem services and life cycle thinking to support more sustainable management and policy decisions. Over to the two of you.
Thank you, Leanne, for the nice introduction. Can everyone hear me okay? Good. So next slide, please, Kerry. Because we won't be able to discuss all the results and all the findings that we had, we decided to focus on 4 areas of results. So I will make a start by presenting some of the learnings from a comparative analysis of the 11 farmer clusters to basically learn a bit more about their dynamic development trajectories over the life of the project. And then I will also focus on the qualitative interviews we carried out with farmers in selected clusters in year 1 and year 4 to learn about potential changes in farmer values, farmer motivations, identity, and biodiversity-related practices. I will also touch on the economic experiments that we carried out and hand over to Claudio, who will talk about the complex systems analysis that Rachel was already briefly touching on, and the sustainability assessment tool that we developed as part of framework. Next slide, please. So the comparative analysis of the 11 clusters was a fairly collaborative process involving all the clusters, all the facilitators, the people working in those clusters. And we first of all had to decide what we are actually measuring when we want to compare those 11 clusters. So what do we actually consider as success or proxies of success in terms of farmers collaborating at the landscape scale? So we collaboratively decided to settle on Walton et al.'s 5 success criteria, which are achievements of social, environmental, and economic goals, as well as the durability and the acceptance of the cluster, meaning that durability, how durable is the cluster, for example, if a scheme stops or if the framework project finishes. and the acceptance of a cluster, whether a cluster farmers accept the cluster in itself and whether locals accept the cluster and whether the cluster is supported by local networks. And so these photos on the side are basically just illustrative examples of tree planting activities, school kids learning about farmland biodiversity, or a biodiversity path that was established as part of the framework project in the Czech cluster. So all signs of success, or could be considered parts of success within those clusters where these activities happened. So we used those 5 criteria, next slide please, to analyze those 11 clusters. And we found 5 interdependent formative dimensions that highly influence the development and the outcomes and ultimately the success of those clusters. These formative dimensions are governance, meaning the structures and the processes that could be set up to manage the cluster. Then leadership, Rachel referred to that before, whether leadership was provided by a lead farmer or a partner in the local vicinity. Facilitation, whether there was one facilitator in practice or whether there was a facilitation team. Then the characteristics of the group, the in-group characteristic that may actually hinder or foster collaboration within the cluster. And then finally, the context. The context, not only the biophysical context, but also the cultural, the historical context, whether that context may actually ease or provide a barrier to collaboration. And so having identified those 5 formative dimensions, we used those to then introduce a matrix, what we called a sustainability assessment matrix, and then analyzed each cluster across those 5 dimensions. And what we see here are the kite diagrams of all the 11 farmer clusters across this 5-point Likert scale, where we then assessed each of these. And what it actually shows is basically that none of the farmer clusters have evolved along the same pathway, and they are all at a different development stage at the end of the project, and that they have achieved quite different things, and that can be explained partly by this maturity assessment framework. So on the next slide, I will explain this in a little bit more detail. Though on the left-hand side, the English farmer cluster, which could be described as an archetypical example with high levels of maturity reached fairly rapidly. And this wasn't very surprising, because if we think about the governance structures that have been set up in the UK for quite some time, the clusters are supported by agri-environmental schemes. Facilitator networks have been in place, so that this cluster in the UK that was established as part of framework could fairly rapidly move forward in terms of identifying biodiversity targets and implementing those targets. In contrast, on the right-hand side, the Italian cluster had a fairly difficult context and group characteristics which challenged the cluster from establishing governance structures and leadership despite fairly skillful facilitation. And that was due to the fact that in the Italian cluster, we have olive groves that are managed extensively and organically by a wide range of farmers, from hobby farmers to commercial olive growers. And they have quite divergent views and values, and that in fact hindered the clusters from formulating biodiversity targets and from moving forward together. However, having said that, that cluster has moved on, and so these kite diagrams are basically also snapshots in times. And so what we found is that the maturity assessment matrix has been very useful in terms of presenting those kite diagrams to all the different clusters, and then figuring out that this is actually a good way for the clusters to reflect upon their progress and also on their capacity in terms of achieving their goals. What is realistic in terms of a cluster that has a fairly difficult context or group characteristics? What is achievable in a time frame of project of 5 years? And that might be quite different in terms of achievements in comparison to an English cluster. So this matrix could be used in the future by clusters in terms of discussing their progress and what can be achieved. So now I would like to quickly move on to the results from the interviews with some farmers in selected clusters. The key insights from there was basically that collaboration among farmers within clusters is pivotal in terms of fostering a deeper and longer lasting engagement with biodiversity. And that has helped to change farmers, how they see themselves and how they see each other. And also we could see a shift from isolated farm level action to socially embedded learning communities that enables, in fact, a more meaningful behavioral change. And that this change in identity, which is often overlooked in policy, might actually be, in fact, be a powerful lever for policy design. And in terms of moving forward and to scale up the success of the farmer clusters, EU policy should move beyond funding for environmental measures only to also fund the social infrastructure, especially facilitation and peer learning that drives change within farming communities. And this was also confirmed in the economic experiments that we conducted outside the clusters, which basically confirmed that farmer clusters offer practical advantage for implementing collective result-based schemes. However, they really depend on trust and the feasibility of the collective action. And further, we also found that farmers prefer the option to join a farmer cluster instead of being prescribed to join a cluster to access agri-environmental schemes. I will now hand over to Claudio, who will talk now about the complex systems analysis and assessment tool.
Thank you, Iris. So building on what Iris just presented, I would like now to briefly shift the perspective to look at the farmer cluster from a broader sustainability standpoint, with the objective of first providing how we provide policy support, and also in the next slide it will be when I will talk about the monitoring. So from the eyes of a researcher that has been working for years on system modeling and sustainability assessment, when I look at farmer cluster, I see immediately a complex socio-ecological system. As Rachel briefly mentioned before, we first analyzed and represented the socio-ecological network of the farmer cluster, in which we mapped the relationship between farmers, the ecological entities in the landscape, and the exchange of knowledge and information within this network. And based on these observations, we then develop what we call an agent-based model that you can see a representation, graphical representation in the center, which is essentially a simulation environment where we have virtual farmers that operate in a virtual landscape. The aim of this exercise is to capture in a very simplified way how collective outcomes can emerge from mainly individual decision. And the objective is to explore how policy might influence these dynamics that we simulate. So in the model, we have farmers that run their own farming businesses, but through their membership in a farmer cluster, they are exposed and they acquire knowledge to the possibility of adopting practices that Graham mentioned in the introductions: flower strips, field margins, hedgerows, etc. So this decision gradually, in our simulation, modify the landscape, and the model tracks how these changes influence key ecosystem services indicators such as pollination, pest control, and others. So in this way, the model allows us to explore how by different providing different policy stimulus, such as incentives, we can see how farmers can be influenced, the landscape change, and ultimately analyze the impact in a broader, from a broader environmental perspective along this whole supply chain. So the figure on the right-hand side shows an example of the output that our model produces. Each colored symbol represents a different policy scenario. For example, different subsidy for different agro-environmental schemes. The model predicts how this scenario affects several environmental indicators, such as climate change impact, ecotoxicity, erosion, soil carbon, etc. But importantly, we also include social outcomes, because this is very important component of a network. For instance, at the bottom, the last line with the red arrow, you can see an indicator related to cluster abandonment, which reflects for each simulation the risk that farmers stop participating in the collaboration. And this is quite revealing, because in this example that we show, scenario with without subsidies or very little subsidies leads to the highest level of cluster abandonment, showing how the absence of incentive can undermine collaboration. So if we can take one key message from this, is that policy needs to support not only the environmental practices, but also what we call the social infrastructure of collaboration, especially through facilitation. We have seen example before from IRIS. So without coordination and resources to sustain facilitation, the stability of farmer cluster becomes much more fragile. So next slide, please. So now in this last slide, I would like to move out from the virtual world and conclude with a closer look on how we approach the sustainability assessment of the farmer clusters. So this work has been led by Rachel from the GWCT together with LIST and the James Hutton Institute. So the starting idea was that when farmers collaborate, the impacts often go beyond biodiversity alone. So collaboration can influence directly or indirectly environmental performances, the economic resilience, the knowledge exchange, and the social dynamics. We wanted to capture this, and we initially identified 35 sustainability indicators covering all the axes of sustainability, environment, economic, and social. But we quickly realized that asking farmers or facilitators to report on so many indicators will simply be too demanding. And indeed, we observe survey fatigue during the project. So we had the issue to streamline the assessment tool to 15 questions with 15 indicators using a 4-tier traffic light scoring system. You can see an example of the bottom in the bottom of the slide. So with this framework, scores above 75% indicate that the cluster is moving in a positive sustainability direction. The radar charts on the left-hand side of the slide shows an example of result for 4 farmer clusters in our project. And each axis represents a different dimension of sustainability, environmental aspects, but also economic and social ones, such as profitability, stakeholder dialogue, local value creation, and quality of life, as an example. What this figure shows quite nicely is that each cluster has its own sustainability profile. Some clusters perform strongly in certain areas, as you can see, while others have more room for improvement. So this makes it easy to spot strengths and potential gaps. And this, so that the main purpose while we create this tool is really to support discussions and learning within the cluster, helping facilitators or the farmer cluster lead to reflect on their progress. But not only that, also identify priorities for action and support dialogue with stakeholders. So next slide, please. So with this, I would like to thank you for your attention. If you're interested in exploring these approaches or the overall project, don't hesitate to ask questions now. And you can find more information on the portal recodo.io, where all access links for the tool I presented are available. Thank you very much for your attention.
That's excellent. Thank you, Claudio. Thank you, Iris. Now we are into our time for questions. So I know we have some questions prepared in advance. I'm going to hand over to Kerry to manage those. But if you have questions coming from the audience, please do add those in the chat. We're quite happy. We have a good half hour now for conversation. And this is, for me at least, often the most interesting part of the discussion. So please do put your questions in the chat. Over to you, Kerry.
Well, thanks very much to the panel. That was a great set of insights and a very coordinated presentation as well. So impressive on both counts. So I'm gonna start with a question that's quite a big question. But should every country, at least in Europe, but probably other places as well, should everybody be encouraging and supporting farmer clusters? There we are. I said it was a big one. I don't know. Would you like to react to that? Because I'm looking at the map, and obviously there's quite a lot of different groups being supported across Europe, but not everybody's doing it yet. Mm-hmm. And including in Scotland, I don't believe that we support farmer clusters. Yeah. So should we? Scotland? Should we and everywhere else?
Simple answer, I think, is yes. I think the conclusion of not necessarily the conclusion in terms of there's written up reports and the policy briefs, etc., but having been through the entire experience myself over 5 years and seeing all of the different examples, the complex benefits of the collective action, as much as anything, the ability to work at landscape, but work together, importantly, the collective action is very clear and very strong. So it's very difficult for me to see what a downside to it would be. You're not going to make every farmer join a cluster. I don't think that's the point. But actually, if every country offered a scheme that would support facilitation, then I think the degree, what we have seen is, I think almost universally, the degree of uptake would be large. Yeah, and that's across many different sort of cultural settings, different farming systems. All sorts of variety. I think I think we saw that the benefits accrue. So the answer, yeah.
And then I guess there's a couple of questions in the chat, but just before we come to those, following on from that, obviously there are probably differences between what's happening in, say, the Netherlands versus England versus Australia, and you collectively have knowledge of all of these. So are there certain models of support for farmer clusters and groups that you would, I don't know, recommend, or is it just a case of wherever there's an agricultural policy, make sure that it has some funding for groups? Are there some details in the support that matter? And please, anybody on the panel answer. I'm not going to kind of point at any of you.
So just to sort of give some insight to that, there are differences. So, for example, in England, there is the facilitation fund that will support the use of facilitators directly. It's also worth noting, though, that not all the farms rely entirely on that, and actually they do self-fund. The clusters will self-fund by making, a hectare contribution typically to support facilitators as well. So for me, that seems to be a very straightforward approach. Now, in England, they've got different schemes now. So DEFRA have got the Adopt Fund out, which is to look at innovation from the farmer's perspective and have farmer-led innovation. But some of that is money to support facilitation, because it recognises that farmers don't necessarily have, all of that spare time and capacity to develop these ideas without some support. I would favour that more general approach than the one in the Netherlands, where agri-environment schemes in particular are the focus of the cluster engagement, because they've got to form cooperatives. They can only apply for agri-environment schemes as a cooperative. Now, I don't know, I can't recall off the top of my head, one of our colleagues might, how the facilitation activity is embodied within that. But in a sense, it's a little bit more targeted, a little bit more pointed, and perhaps this may not be fair, but strikes me as potentially being too narrow, slightly too narrow. Whereas I think the breadth of the breadth is important. There's lots of things that clusters could work towards, not just a particular agri-environment scheme with a facilitation to support that. So those were just some thoughts. Yeah.
Does anybody else on the panel want to disagree with Graham or add anything to that? And if not, we'll switch to the questions that we have coming in the chat now.
Kerry, maybe just adding, because of the very different contexts in the different countries, like in the Netherlands, there has been these collective payments for over a decade now that farmers are used to apply through these collective funds. And in France, there are also schemes that have been available for farmers for quite some time, that every country may offer slightly different potential prospective schemes that would be very useful. But certainly, I think facilitation would be one that would be very useful. So agreeing with Graham.
Okay, right. Well, on a slightly different tack, I'm going to pick up some of the questions in the chat. Sorry if I don't cover them all, but hopefully we will have time to get through most of it, because we plan to go to 15:15, so to make sure we've got time for this. So the first question we had comes from Mike Thornton, and he asks, how do the clusters perform? What's their effectiveness, depending on what agricultural sector is represented in them? So, for example, is there a difference between arable and livestock-dominated groups? I don't know if your data give you any ideas about this.
Yeah, they do. Let me again sort of start off, not necessarily providing a comprehensive answer to Mike's question, but maybe just start a bit of discussion. So we did cover multiple different types of cropping systems in different settings. Everything from fairly conventional, let's call it industrialized arable settings, several examples of that, to for example, a combination of hobbyist and commercial olive producers in the Montepulciano in Italy. So quite a variety. And I think there is a tendency to find some differences as well, but I don't know that it's necessarily down to the types of production. So where we have smaller scale, let's call it less industrialized settings, I think there's a little bit more natural scope for people to be able to focus on the idea of the use of clusters. There's perhaps less tie into an existing structure that sees production of a few commodities in a structured and simplified way, where for example, in the Scottish system, farmers are not used at all to working together in a collaborative setting. But I don't know that necessarily it's to do with the cropping system, but it's how those cropping systems have evolved and what they currently look like at the moment. Yeah. So yes, but I don't think it's actually. I think it's more a correlation than a causative effect of the different types of farming system. I don't know what Iris has got some experience of this, but I don't know whether Iris would agree, or I'm sure there's more to say than that. It's a bit more complicated, probably.
Yeah, I would agree, but also mentioning that it's probably more complicated, like our social work. We formulated it maybe as a limitation of our research, where we argue that we may have attracted the more environmentally friendly farmers to form farmer clusters across Europe. So just to give an example, in the Czech Republic, for example, we faced the challenge in a post-socialist country where neighboring farmers generally don't collaborate with each other, and found it quite difficult to get a farmer cluster established. And so the only cluster that we were able to establish after quite some time was an organic cluster led by one of the organic pioneers in the 1990s. And that is where we could establish the cluster. So there may be a bias by where we could, in fact, establish the clusters. And hence, it's a bit tricky to then compare the arable clusters within the arable clusters, but then also across farming systems.
Yes, I was wondering about that. We're getting into a slightly different point there of, are there certain types of farmers or individuals that choose to participate in clusters? And I guess then if we see more farmer clusters, who's left out or who's left behind? And it can be quite hard to know that for sure, but very interesting to hear your reflections there on that. Well, I'm going to just be very unoriginal and go to one of the next questions that followed in the chat, which was about measuring the effectiveness. So Iris and Claudio, you had really lovely kite diagrams there. And the question in the chat was about the measurements of ecological effectiveness or impact. Were you able to directly measure any of this, or did you have to use kind of proxies or people's impressions of their ecological and environmental impacts?
Well, let me just jump in here. We invested an enormous amount of time and effort monitoring biodiversity across the clusters. It was quite an effort, because you can imagine we're attempting to monitor a set of biodiversity indicators at that large scale and attempt to identify effects at scale. And even though we pushed the project out to 5 years, that's a relatively short time frame over which to really see, changes in ecosystem function and consequently biodiversity. So as we'd entirely expected at the beginning of the project, the results were variable. One thing that we have found is that the indications are where there are focused actions around a key component of biodiversity. Let's, for argument's sake, say corn buntings and the Scottish cluster, that the clusters tended to be successful in having the outcomes that they were prioritizing. Yeah, but we didn't necessarily see that in all instances translating to a general boost for biodiversity. Yeah, so there's a lot more to uncover amongst all of the data that we've got. We've only just about cleaned it all up, let alone begun to analyze it, even though the project is complete now. So there's an awful lot of data that we've got to dig into, but I still think that's going, the general picture is the one that I've just set out. But Rachel was involved quite a lot in terms of setting up and designing the monitoring. So I'll just ask Rachel, do you think that's fair enough, Rachel, as a sort of a very simple take-home message? What else might we say?
No, I think that's pretty much it. That's what the results seem to show, is that, we selected indicators. I think we selected 6 landscape scale biodiversity indicators, and I think it was something like into the tens of thousands of man hours to conduct the surveys in a backy design. So we did one at the beginning as the farm clusters were forming, and then one towards the end of the project, to see if there was any change, and we could track changes. But it was definitely seemed to be tailored towards the farm clusters that had aimed for a specific species or target, had then done that as a cluster across the landscape. We didn't manage to see positive changes in overall biodiversity in all the different indicators, regardless of what had been done. It tended to be tailored to what they had input, but yeah.
Yeah, and if I can add, for the 2 tools I presented, so for the simulation tool, we basically implemented a similar model that you can find in Feast. So the tool that presented Rachel, where you can design your landscape interventions and then have an estimation of provision of habitats. And so it's very well advanced model, but it's still a model that is linking nesting habitats, resources and food resources for different species. So that's model based, and we simplified that also in the agent-based model. Whereas for the sustainability indicators, that's also I think reported through the questions in the questionnaire with the 15 indicators that we selected, and few of them are focusing on biodiversity.
Thank you. So in summary, I think quite an impressive interdisciplinary set of data collection initiatives going on, and as well as modelling and representation of it. So hopefully that answers the original question in the chat. I'm going to throw something completely different at you now. There's a question in here about markets, and obviously farmers are not just influenced by agri-environment policy, but they should be selling food or fodder or products to markets. So there's an interest there to know about supply chains. The question is, were there any market contributions to the clusters? For example, preferential supply chain access from wholesalers or supermarkets. So I suppose this might be part of that kind of socioeconomic context that the groups operate within. Did you pick up any insights about if that was affecting what the farmer clusters achieved?
So let me just set the scene for this, and I'll then hand over to Claudio. So as part of the work we did, we looked at incentives, public and private, but most of the results really told, the economic experiments told us more about the effectiveness of public incentives and so on. And we didn't research at that level in great detail, how green financing might work with this quite generally. However, in one of our clusters, which was the Luxembourg cluster, which is why I'm going to hand over to Claudio in a minute, that was built around a relationship with a cider producer, and so immediately, so that they were a driving force of the cluster. So that gives us not a large data set, but a particular example where there was a role of the markets in sort of driving what happened. So Claudio, do you want to add a little bit more background to that?
Sure. So it's again, anecdotal is one cluster, but what we observed there here in Luxembourg is that there is this cider company, and they wanted to differentiate their products, really leveraging the biodiversity friendliness of their cider, and therefore they act as an aggregator, so that they were hosting the farmer clusters. So all meetings of farmer cluster were hosted in the venue owned by the cider company, and they were providing food, and they were creating social events as a side also of the main meeting. So it was really a social engagement from this across the supply chain, and I think it worked very well, and they are still working together. So
that's a great example. Yeah, no, that's great to hear about the detail of some of these. And there's also some questions in the chat here about nature markets and green finance, of course, which can mean many things to different people, but this idea that perhaps farmers might be managing their land to sequester carbon with new partners who are seeking to offset or mitigate their carbon emissions. And I'm just wondering, possibly not, but in your set of farmer groups that you engaged with, were there any signs of links with or interest in those kinds of issues and opportunities? Might not be.
So I would say broadly, the green finance and the markets around that were a bit early for us to have much of that going on. Yeah. However, there were definitely organizations. So I forget the name of the organization which one of the Austrian clusters was involved with, but it was one of the organic related organizations, and they were quite influential in the actions and provided lots of opportunity for the cluster to engage in something sort of bigger than just themselves. So it's not quite the green financing, but that was one that came a little bit towards that involvement of an outside organization with its own but parallel objectives that could see the benefits in the cluster. So I was slightly disappointed by the lack of private finance interest that there was, but I genuinely think it's just that actually it's not general enough to be able to, so that we could go to any European country now, set up a cluster, and it would still be a matter of luck as to whether there would be something suitable that offered them that green financing opportunity to plug into. Yeah. What we didn't have within the project was the resources, the capacity to begin to promote those ourselves. Yeah, so we were reliant on whether there was anything extant or anything, within the system that cluster was operating that we could pick up on. So
yeah, I appreciate your project was not a project focused on that, but I guess everyone's just curious to kind of spot all the links where they might exist. Maybe that should be the next project.
Yes.
So maybe I give you an easier question. Well, maybe not. Maybe I don't know if it's hard or easy. But there's a couple of questions in the chat about group size. So there's maybe an idea. Do some clusters get too big and they become inefficient? Or in the case with the olive producers, when they get very large, they get more diverse. Maybe we get more conflict. So I guess, Iris, you mentioned the olives, I think, but all of you, I mean, what's your feeling about what's the right size of a group, or is that impossible to say?
So I'm going to say the right size. Well, it depends on the sort of producers you're talking about and the areas being covered and so on and so forth. But order of magnitude 10 farmers.
Okay, Graham says Scotland, 10. I want to know what everyone else says.
We had 5, and that was quite small. And then if you get much above 10, it gets tricky. But in how many was it in the Cranbourne Chase cluster, Rachel? We're into 20 something, yeah.
I think we had 22 to 24. I think one joined and one left at some point, but I think we may have ended on about 23 or 22. But that seems to be. We were sort of capped where we were because our Cranbourne Chase cluster is in amongst a whole other range of farmer clusters that are already a part of the Avon Valley. So we had to cap it. I think a lot of the ones in that area kind of have to cap it around the 20 farmer mark, and then you sort of go on to the next one and you would be part of another one that would form. But I think also it depends if it's simply a cluster with one lead farmer and one facilitator and it's lots of farms, it's going to struggle. It needs a steering group. So where you have there's the cluster in the Cotswolds, Northeast Cotswold cluster is absolutely massive, but they have a huge steering group, their own website. They've got like their own director, they've got 2 facilitators, they've got their own comms department. They've kind of really gone for it, and that must work for them, and they seem to be doing really well with it. It's just a matter of you do then need that bigger group steering everything, and I think luckily the Cranbourne Chase one had a steering group of maybe up to 10 farmers, so half of the cluster were sort of involved in steering everything and the group discussions with the facilitator, and then sort of filtering it back out to all the other farmers as to what the plan was, sort of thing. And I think that's what you're going to have to do if you get bigger.
Yeah, so different governance arrangements for bigger groups. Claudio, Iris, what's your feeling about group size? Pick a number. No, you don't have to.
Yeah, I would say that the bigger issue is the very small size of a group, because if then someone leaves, the cluster becomes not functional, or not being a cluster anymore. So I think if the cluster grows, that's a lot easier to deal with in terms of what Rachel and what we just said in terms of governance structures and processes, whereas a small cluster, that's a lot trickier to manage. So I would think that, let's say 5 would be probably the smallest I would go for, because otherwise it's just too dangerous in terms of losing people and not being able to actually really achieve something on the landscape scale.
Yeah. And Claudio, last but not least.
Yeah, I'm also between 10 and 20, but that's my educated guess.
Yeah. No, I understand that in different contexts, in different countries, we're going to have different sizes of farms. And some of them will be very, sort of the geography of the landscape matters here and what people relate to. So there's lots of things that feed into it, but also this sense, we have questions in the chat about the internal dynamics of it and how easy or hard it is to facilitate that and manage conflict also comes into what makes sense for the size. So it's interesting to hear those different points of view, because you're all bringing in different reasons why it needs to be not too big, but also not too small. So we're coming to the end, but we still have about nearly 10 minutes. And I'm going to maybe ask Rachel to pick up on one of the very specific comments in the chat, which was about England. To beg the forgiveness of those of you who maybe are not so interested in England, but it's a question from Matt Smith. And he says, in England, we've seen many of the round 1 and round 2 landscape recovery projects being led by farmer clusters that were already formed. So the question is, were the clusters already in existence, and what has framework revealed about how best to encourage the development of regional clusters of those not already engaged? And then what was the value added to the businesses engaged in a cluster? I'm not sure what you mean there, Matt, if you mean the farm businesses or other businesses, but certainly, yeah. Does that question make sense to you, Rachel?
Yeah, I'll try. So the framework farmer clusters, I think the English one was in the process of being formed when we started the framework project. So we had a sort of easy ride there. But all the other ones across Europe, I don't think many of them were already formed, and it was a lot of hard work getting them together. It required advertising, trying to find farmers in an area. I think Iris said earlier it was the only organic farm, or like leading organic farm in Czech Republic that was able to convince them to start a cluster. I think in Estonia they struggled as well, because it's also post-communist, and I think they didn't like the idea of having to work together and collaborate. So it was very difficult, and we have managed to publish a paper on basically a troubleshooting guide of how to form and manage a farmer cluster for practitioners, because that is the tricky part. If you're in an area that isn't used to farmer clusters, it can be quite difficult. I'm just trying to see what else was in the question. What else? How best to encourage the development of regional clusters of those not aware. I guess we're kind of hoping that through this project and through starting these little clusters across Europe, we're hoping that it will become less of an unknown thing. And I think the reason it's done so well in the UK is it's been around for so long. We had like agri-environment schemes implemented from the 80s and 90s. So farmers have already started getting into the idea of, okay, I've got to set land aside, I've got to think about biodiversity. And farmer clusters came along, and it wasn't, I think, as Iris was talking about, it was already an idea, it was already in place. It was already sort of in the mindset of we're quite lucky that a lot of British farmers are already in the mindset of, okay, we've got to be sustainable, we've got to be thinking about biodiversity. And I think that even in areas of the UK where individual farmers just aren't interested, they just don't want to know, I'm not really sure. I don't know if you have any ideas, Graham, of how to convince farmers that they need to be.
This is a general question, of course, isn't
friendly.
This isn't specific to England or anywhere, of course. There's always differences between every single land manager has got different aptitudes and interests and capacity to get involved. So I'm sure you've all got ideas on this. But maybe just before, so there's maybe our very final topic before we close that kind of links to this. Someone's noted in the chat that we're beginning to see farmer clusters happening in Scotland, where I'm sitting, where some of us are sitting today, even though there is no formal sort of agri-environment scheme that funds it, or sort of any other kind of place that could be funding it. So this is just bearing witness to what you were just saying, Rachel, that sometimes farmers and land managers are interested in this form of working, and to some extent will start to get involved in it even without formal policy nudges. But of course, if we want to see this happening in the long term, and to ensure that more people get involved, it's probably wise to actually be trying to enable it and to support the facilitators, not just hope that there's more bottom-up action. So I guess one question for all of you is what would you do to make farmer clusters or groups sustainable in the long term? Because I think long-term working is often so challenging but necessary. We talked earlier about how useful it is to have policy support for this. But is there anything in particular about working long term that you would think would be really helpful to help see that happen?
Yeah, let me kick off. I think farmer clusters, so working collectively, but also at the landscape scale, is a valuable approach for lots of things that need to happen within the agricultural and agri-food system. So I think it's sensible to actually have it as, if you like, an underpinning capacity to our agricultural system. So not just funded as a scheme that comes and goes, but actually to realise that it will support lots of schemes that would operate within agriculture, particularly in terms of sustainability, but sustainability across, environment, economics, and social strands. So I would actually like to see it identified in policy as something that can facilitate lots of other outcomes. And so to maintain a facilitation fund and to promote collective action through that as a foundational layer on which other policies can then be built, I think would be very effective at making those other policies more successful. But it obviously requires a reasonable and long-term commitment to do that, and quite what the policy framing would be to allow that to happen, I'm not entirely sure.
It's always challenging to allocate with certainty future budgets or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
So I know it's a difficult question I ask you at the end, perhaps unfair. But Claudio, Iris, is there anything you wanted to add on the how to help groups to work in the long term?
Yeah, I think from the
I personally think.
Sorry, Iris. Lady first.
So, Claudia, I basically wanted to mention the Luxembourg example. I think to have the value chain somehow included in the cluster is very useful in terms of having people with a vested interest, but that interest should be broader. That should be not economic interest, that should be really biodiversity interest. So, for example, besides the cluster in Luxembourg, where we have the vested interest of the cider producer, we have seen in the Spanish cluster, which is also an olive cluster, that the olives are fairly traditionally managed, fairly intensively, and cultural norms have really prevented to have like ground cover, and all the ground cover has been cleared away for decades, and hence it's very difficult to actually have farmers leaving that ground cover in place or sowing ground cover. And if we would have the value chain included, the olive producer and the mill who actually makes the olive oil, if the mill would be pushing the farmers into the direction to actually have more sustainable production, and that could be then also labeled on the olive oil, that this would be also really helping at least some of the value chains to have more sustainable production. I would think so. As a very good example already in place, the Luxembourg, and I think the Spanish cluster could follow such an approach by having the mill involved a lot more.
That sounds great, and definitely leads us into a topic for a discussion on another day. Claudio, did you have any final thoughts on that before we wrap up?
Yeah, I totally second what Graham said and Iris about the supply chain and the support from the government. But another aspect I would like to emphasize is the concept of stewardship of the land, right? And I think this really emerged in a lot of discussion within the farmer cluster. So farmers are also the steward of the land. And by opening up to society. So there were many initiatives during the project, like BioBlitz, in which citizens were walking through the orchards in Luxembourg, but also this happened in other clusters across Europe. And they could talk with the farmers and the difficulties. And I, at the end of the day, I felt that this was what I could observe. There was really this sense of stewardship from the farmers, say, you know, we are here, we open our land, we share our experience. And this was a kind of cement that was tying everything together. So that's probably another component that I would like to add.
And I think that's a great note to add on. So to finish on, sorry, so stewardship, value chains and supply chains and policy, if we can get all of these things, think about all of them as we develop farmer clusters, then we'll solve everything, right? So on that note, I'm going to say thank you very much to our panel, and I'm going to stop bombarding you with questions. And Leanne, leave it to you for any final words.
Just to thank everyone again for coming today, for the speakers today. Graham, thank you for the fantastic project that you've led in the introduction, and Iris and Claudio and Rachel, thank you for your talks as well. It's been really insightful and hopefully inspiring to the people in the room today. We'll be carrying on with our ILUSC seminar series. We will let you know in due course what the next one is. We're thinking forestry, so that can be quite exciting, but we will give you more details. It just remains to close, and thank you so much again for coming. This will be available on the ILUSC webpage of the Hutton site.